He always sat in the corner of the lunchroom, quietly opening his small lunchbox. It was nothing special, a simple sandwich wrapped in paper, maybe a few crackers or a bruised apple. Other kids barely noticed, but this lunch meant more than anyone knew. What was hidden inside that modest sandwich wasn't just food, it was a message from a past long buried. One day, his teacher, walking by, caught a glimpse of what was tucked inside the wrapping, an old yellowed note folded carefully, one she recognized instantly. Her hands trembled as she read it. It was her own handwriting, written decades ago to a student she once helped when no one else would. And now, across generations, that simple note had found its way back to her, carried by the grandchild of the boy she once saved. In that moment, lunch became more than a meal. It became a full circle of kindness that neither of them ever expected. The lunchroom hummed with the same steady current of noise it carried every day. The clatter of plastic trays, the scraping of metal chair legs on linoleum, the overlapping voices of hundreds of conversations merged into one constant, chaotic backdrop. It was a living thing, this room, a breathing, pulsing ecosystem of students sorting themselves into familiar clusters. Friends greeted each other with loud voices and wide gestures. Tables filled quickly, the popular groups arranging themselves like choreographed performances, while others found quiet pockets to exist in the background. In the far right corner of the room, next to a wall streaked with years of fingerprints and scuff marks, sat the boy, always the same spot, always alone. His table was small, round, and slightly uneven, one of the older tables that wobbled if you leaned on it the wrong way. But it was his, not because anyone had assigned it to him, but because no one else ever sat there. It offered a partial shield from the energy of the lunchroom. The noise still reached him, of course, but it softened against the wall. He could watch without being pulled in, observe without participating. And that was how he preferred it. Not because he didn't want friends, but because it was simpler, safer. The corner gave him space to breathe, to exist without the pressure of fitting into conversations or navigating the shifting alliances of adolescence. Every day, precisely at the same time, he would walk into the lunchroom with his head slightly lowered, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and his lunchbox cradled carefully in both hands. The lunchbox was small, sturdy, and plain, navy blue with a black zipper that had been replaced once after it broke. It wasn't new, but it was well cared for. He carried it with a kind of reverence, as though what was inside mattered more than anyone could understand. And to him, it did. He moved through the lunch line quickly, bypassing the hot meals offered by the cafeteria, always politely declining when the lunch ladies asked if he wanted something. They had learned not to push. He brought his own food every day, and they respected that. Some of the cafeteria staff had come to recognize him, nodding silently as he passed. To them, he was just another quiet kid. To the students, he was invisible. At the corner table, he would sit down and place the lunchbox in front of him with deliberate care. He unzipped it slowly, almost ceremonially, as if unwrapping something fragile. Inside was always the same simple meal: a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a small piece of fruit, sometimes an apple, sometimes a banana, and occasionally a few crackers in a small plastic bag. No elaborate snacks, no store-bought treats, no thermoses filled with hot food, just enough to fill his stomach and get him through the rest of the day. But the sandwich was where the real ritual lived. Every morning, his grandmother made it for him. She had done so for as long as he could remember. The bread was usually plain white or wheat, sometimes a little stale by the time lunch arrived, but always neatly wrapped in layers of paper to keep it protected. And tucked inside, folded carefully between the sandwich layers or slipped under the wax paper, was a small note. Always the note. He never read the notes in the cafeteria. They weren't for public display. They were private messages, tiny pieces of comfort his grandmother sent him to carry through the day. Sometimes the notes were short phrases of encouragement. Sometimes they were longer, telling small stories or sharing wisdom. Sometimes they were simply hearts drawn in blue ink. But they were always there. And every time he opened his lunch, he felt the familiar bump of folded paper beneath his fingers. The other students didn't notice. If they did, they didn't care. His corner table was too far from the main clusters of activity. The louder groups filled the center tables with their laughter and arguments, their Snapchat filters and inside jokes. The athletes gathered near the exit, trading banter and tossing crumpled napkins at each other. The band kids and debate teams occupied their usual benches along the windows. The ones like him, quiet, drifting students without tight circles, occupied the peripheries. But even among them, he remained separate, not excluded, simply apart. Teachers patrolled the lunchroom casually, some chatting with students, others standing near the walls with their arms crossed, watching for trouble. Occasionally, one would glance in his direction, but they rarely approached. He never caused problems, never raised his voice, never sought attention. His grades were solid, his behavior unremarkable. To most adults in the building, he was simply a good kid, one of the easy ones. But no one asked about the notes. The lunchroom clock ticked steadily above the main doors, counting down the 45 minutes allotted for lunch. He always finished early. His routine never wavered. Unpack, eat slowly, rewrap, zip up, sit quietly until the bell rang. It was predictable, and in that predictability, he found safety. The world outside the lunchroom held too many unknowns, too many things he couldn't control. But here, at least, there was structure. Outside of school, life was more fragile. His grandmother worked long hours at a local laundromat, her hands rough from years of folding and washing. The apartment they shared was small but clean, filled with the scent of lavender from the air freshener she bought in bulk. He knew they didn't have much, but she always made sure he had food, clean clothes, and those small handwritten notes. She told him often that the world might not always see him clearly, but he should never forget who he was. That corner table in the lunchroom became an extension of that small apartment, a piece of home he carried with him into the noisy, unpredictable world of high school. Every time he unwrapped his sandwich, feeling the smooth edges of folded paper hidden inside, he was reminded of the care behind it. It wasn't just food, it was protection, it was history, it was love made tangible. What he didn't know yet, what would unfold only in the days to come, was that one of those notes carried more than comfort. One of those notes carried a connection to a past he hadn't yet fully understood, a past that would rise unexpectedly into his present. And when it did, everything in that lunchroom corner would shift, not because of the sandwich, not because of the lunchbox, but because of the words written long ago by a teacher who never imagined she would see them again in the hands of a new generation. For now, though, the boy continued his quiet routine, unaware of the circle that was slowly, silently closing around him. The sandwich was eaten. The note remained unread, safely folded. And as the lunch bell rang and students poured back into the hallways, the corner table stood quietly behind him, waiting for the moment when its quiet history would finally be seen. The morning sun crept through the thin blinds of their apartment, casting faint stripes across the small kitchen table where his grandmother prepared his lunch like she had every morning for as long as he could remember. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, mixed with the scent of pressed shirts and floor cleaner. The tiny kitchen was barely big enough for the two of them, but it held a quiet rhythm that was both ordinary and sacred. The routine was simple but deliberate, like a ritual designed to ground them both before the day stretched forward with all its unknowns. She stood at the counter with practiced movements, laying out the 2 slices of bread on a cutting board while the butter knife rested on the plate. The sandwich always came together the same way. Some mornings it was simple turkey and cheese, other mornings just peanut butter with no jelly because jelly was a luxury they often skipped to stretch the groceries longer. But always it was wrapped tightly in wax paper, folded over itself to keep everything secure and tidy for him. After the sandwich was complete, she opened the drawer on the far left of the kitchen counter. It was where she kept her small notepad and ballpoint pen. The notepad was old, the edges curled, and the top sheets slightly yellowed from constant use. Each morning she tore a fresh page, paused for a brief moment to gather her thoughts, and then scribbled down a few words. Some days it was a simple message like, "You've got this," or "Proud of you." On other days she wrote a few lines that resembled small prayers or old sayings she had carried from her own youth. But today was different. Today, her hand hovered longer over the blank paper. The boy didn't notice. He sat at the table tying his shoes and adjusting the straps of his backpack, not watching the quiet deliberation behind him. Her fingers hesitated as they gripped the pen. The words she wrote today were different, though they looked like any of the others to a casual eye. The note was longer, with lines drawn carefully in her looping, cursive handwriting. She folded it gently and slipped it between the layers of the sandwich, wrapping it again with a tight fold of wax paper. She did it without ceremony, as though it was no different from the days before. But something in her chest stirred as she sealed the lunchbox and handed it to him with her usual soft smile. He took it gratefully, his eyes bright with the simple gratitude of a child who had learned not to ask for much but to appreciate everything. He walked to school with the lunchbox swinging gently from his hand, unaware of the quiet weight resting inside. The streets were the same, lined with cracked sidewalks and crooked fences. He passed the corner store where the cashier always nodded at him, past the park where other kids played when the weather allowed. He blended into the city's rhythm, another student on his way to another school day, carrying a lunch prepared with love and, today, something more. The lunchroom greeted him with its usual chorus of noise when the bell rang. He made his way to his usual corner table, passing groups who barely noticed his presence. Some of the students had begun to acknowledge him with brief nods in recent weeks, but he remained mostly invisible to the waves of conversation and movement that swirled around him. This invisibility suited him. It gave him space, and within that space, he unpacked his lunch. He unzipped the lunchbox and pulled out the sandwich wrapped in its familiar paper. As he unwrapped it, his fingers felt the slight bump within the fold, a familiar sensation by now. He knew the note was there. It always was. It was part of the routine, a private gesture from his grandmother that made the noisy cafeteria feel a little less overwhelming. He never read the notes at school. They were for later, when the day was done and he could sit on his bed and unfold them carefully, hearing her voice between the lines. But as he pulled the paper back slightly to take his first bite, the corner of the note slipped free and peeked out. The paper was different today. Not the usual fresh white sheet, but an older piece with faint yellowing at the edges. The creases showed it had been folded and refolded many times. The handwriting, while still hers, carried an extra layer of familiarity that didn't quite match her usual morning notes. He paused for a moment, thumb resting lightly on the exposed edge of the paper, curious. But like every other day, he slid the note back into the fold without reading it, returning his attention to his meal. Across the lunchroom, his teacher walked by. Miss Carter was making her usual rounds, ensuring order was kept, pausing occasionally to speak with groups of students. She had noticed the boy before, sitting alone, always with his carefully packed lunch. She respected his quiet presence, admired his discipline. She never pried into his solitude, but she noticed him in a way most others did not. Today, as she passed his table, her eyes drifted toward the lunchbox just as the note peeked out from the sandwich wrapping. Her breath caught involuntarily. For a split second, the handwriting on the note struck something deep inside her. It was unmistakable. That curve of the capital letters, the way certain words curled at their edges, it was her own handwriting. Not recent, not from this season of her life, but from decades earlier. A buried memory surfaced like a wave breaking through still water. Her mind raced back to years ago, to a boy she once taught named Marcus. A boy who struggled not because he lacked intelligence, but because the world outside the classroom had made everything harder for him. A boy who almost didn't finish school. A boy to whom she had written notes of encouragement, slipping them into his books, his folders, his homework, trying to keep him from giving up. The handwriting was from that time. From that season of quiet battles fought with paper and ink. The coincidence was too sharp to dismiss. Her steps slowed, her heart pounded, but she forced herself to keep moving past the table to avoid drawing attention. She made a mental note to check the class roster again, to trace the boy's last name, to find the thread that might connect the past to the present. The resemblance was there in his face, subtle but undeniable once she allowed herself to see it. The curve of his jaw, the arch of his brow, the quiet way he sat with both strength and gentleness. It was familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Back at his table, the boy finished his sandwich, packed the wax paper carefully back into the lunchbox, and zipped it shut with his usual precision. The bell rang, releasing the waves of students from the cafeteria like water rushing through a gate. He moved with the flow, quiet and steady, unaware of the storm of recognition unfolding quietly inside his teacher's mind. As he returned to his classes, carrying the unopened note in his backpack, Miss Carter sat at her desk during her planning period, pulling up the student files. His last name confirmed what her heart already suspected. The boy was Marcus's grandson. The notes she once wrote for a struggling student had survived through time, cherished enough to be passed from father to son, and now placed into the lunchbox of a grandson she had unknowingly watched for months. The full weight of the moment settled over her like a blanket, both heavy and warm. She thought of Marcus, of his quiet determination, his resilience, his victories and struggles. She thought of the long path that must have brought his family here to this school, to her classroom again. And she thought of the power of words written long ago, words she had once hoped might help a young man believe in himself, never imagining that those same words would find their way back to her through the hands of another child, sitting in the corner seat of the cafeteria. The note in the bread was no longer just a private message from a grandmother to her grandson. It was a bridge across generations. A quiet echo of kindness returned, folding time upon itself in a way neither the boy nor the teacher had expected, and neither yet knew how much more this note would reveal in the days ahead. The next morning came wrapped in the soft glow of early sunlight filtering through clouds that hung heavy over the city. The boy followed the same familiar path to school, his lunchbox carefully balanced in his hand, his backpack secured tightly over his shoulders. The streets bustled around him with the usual rhythm, commuters hurrying to buses, neighbors exchanging brief greetings, the occasional honk from distant traffic. But inside his chest, everything felt as calm and predictable as any other school day. He had no way of knowing that today was different, that something invisible had shifted in the quiet margins of his routine. At school, the day unfolded like a well-worn script. First period came and went, followed by second, and then the bell for lunch rang its usual metallic tone that signaled a temporary release from lessons and textbooks. The boy moved through the hallways with steady steps, his face relaxed and neutral as students jostled for space and called out to their friends. Reaching the cafeteria, he took his place at the corner table, the seat that had always been his. He placed his lunchbox on the surface, smoothed the lid with his hand, and unzipped it with care. The sandwich was there as always, wrapped precisely in wax paper. And like every day before, the small folded note sat tucked beneath the wrapping, waiting quietly to be read later when he was home, away from the noise. Today, however, his teacher was watching. Miss Carter stood near the back of the cafeteria, her usual monitoring duties giving her a natural excuse to be there. But her presence today was different. Her eyes weren't scanning for misbehavior or idle chatter. They were focused on him. She had barely slept the night before, her mind caught in the looping realization that the quiet student she had watched for months was directly connected to a past she had long tucked away in her memory. The moment she had seen the note and recognized the handwriting, the realization had begun to unfold inside her like an old letter being carefully reopened after years of storage. As she watched him now, every detail of his movements seemed both familiar and new. The way he unwrapped the sandwich slowly, the deliberate neatness in how he folded the wax paper back as though preserving something precious, the soft concentration in his eyes, all of it reminded her of Marcus. She had known Marcus as a young man full of silent struggle, balancing the weight of a complicated home life with the demands of school. His family had faced poverty, uncertainty, and countless invisible battles that never made it into his academic file. Yet, Marcus had always arrived at school each day with determination, never asking for special treatment, never allowing the heaviness of his world to disrupt the routine of his learning. She had seen his hunger, not just for food, but for hope, and she had tried in small ways to offer it. She had written notes to Marcus during those difficult years, notes meant to lift him during moments when the world seemed intent on keeping him low. The notes were always personal, handwritten with care, slipped into his textbooks, folded into his assignments, and sometimes passed quietly between pages when he wasn't looking. She never knew what he did with them after reading, only that he smiled softly whenever he found one. She hoped they made a difference. When Marcus graduated, she lost touch with him. Life pulled students forward while teachers remained behind to welcome new faces each year. She thought of him often, but time created distance. Until now. The boy in front of her, unwrapping his sandwich with the same gentleness his father once had, carried not only his own life but the echoes of those old conversations, those quiet messages written by her own hand. The note she saw yesterday had been more than paper. It had been proof that her words had traveled further than she ever imagined. She could no longer sit by without knowing for sure. Later that afternoon, during her free period, Miss Carter sat at her desk staring at the open file folder on her computer screen. She had pulled up the boy's student information again, reading through the basic details, his name, address, emergency contacts, academic performance, all straightforward and familiar. But what struck her most was the listed name of his guardian, Margaret Taylor. The name stopped her breath for a moment. Margaret, Marcus's mother. She remembered her clearly now, a woman who worked tirelessly to provide for her son, who attended every parent-teacher conference with a mixture of pride and exhaustion in her eyes, who once tearfully thanked Miss Carter for helping Marcus stay on track when things at home became too heavy. The connection was no longer a distant suspicion. It was real. The boy was Marcus's son. The revelation filled her with a mixture of awe and humility. The small acts of kindness she had offered Marcus decades ago had not faded into the forgotten corners of memory as she once feared. They had been carried forward, preserved and honored, passed from a father to his child like an heirloom. The notes were not simply tokens of encouragement. They had become threads woven into the fabric of this family's story. And now, here was the next generation, unknowingly carrying those threads back to her. As the final bell rang that day and the students poured into the halls, Miss Carter stood by her classroom door watching them pass. She saw the boy among the crowd, moving with the same quiet presence he always carried. She wanted to call out to him, to ask about his father, to share the weight of recognition blooming in her chest. But she held back. This was not a conversation to rush. It was a delicate bridge, one that needed to be crossed gently and with care. She would wait for the right moment. That evening at home, the boy once again sat on his bed, backpack open beside him, pulling out the day's lunch note. He unfolded the small square of paper, smoothing it across his knee, reading the familiar handwriting that brought a quiet warmth to his heart. He never questioned where the notes originally came from or why his grandmother chose to send them each day. To him, they were simply part of the love she offered, steady and unchanging. But if he had looked closer, he might have noticed how the lines of the paper had softened over years, how the ink had faded slightly in places, how the words sometimes felt older than they should have. He read the note again, folded it with care, and tucked it into the shoebox under his bed where he kept all of them, a small archive of encouragement that made the world feel more steady. Neither he nor his grandmother knew that across the city that same evening, Miss Carter sat in her own small apartment, hands folded over a cup of tea, thinking of the years gone by and the strange beauty of time's circle bringing this connection back to her. She reflected on the long path from Marcus's classroom desk to this boy's corner lunch table, on how words written in a moment of hope could travel across decades to return quietly and unexpectedly. She thought of the unseen power teachers sometimes held, the silent ways they planted seeds that would only bloom long after their work was done. The familiar handwriting on that old note had opened a door she never expected to walk through again. And behind that door was not just memory, but a living, breathing continuation of the story she thought had ended long ago. What she didn't know yet was how deeply this moment would ripple forward, not just for herself or for the boy, but for a community that would soon witness how kindness, no matter how small, carries a weight far heavier than time. The following week began as any other, with the same shuffle of feet through crowded hallways, the same rhythm of morning announcements echoing from classroom speakers, and the same voices blending into the familiar hum of daily routine. But beneath the surface, something had shifted for Miss Carter. Every time she saw the boy now, every glimpse of his quiet, disciplined posture, every careful unpacking of his lunch carried a layer of meaning that no one else could see. The connection between past and present was no longer hypothetical. It was real, woven into the fabric of both their lives, but she had not yet found the moment to speak to him about it. She waited, knowing that something so delicate could not be rushed. The opportunity came unexpectedly during an afternoon study hall when the boy arrived early and sat at a corner desk, absorbed in his work. The rest of the students had not yet filtered into the room, leaving them alone in the soft quiet before the usual noise began. Miss Carter watched him for a few moments, her hands folded on her desk as she gathered the courage to finally bridge the distance between them. The questions she had rehearsed in her mind now sat heavily in her chest. She stood and approached his desk with slow, measured steps, allowing herself one deep breath before she spoke. What began as a simple conversation about his work gently transitioned into questions about his family. She asked about who packed his lunches each day, and he spoke softly about his grandmother, about how she always included small notes tucked inside his sandwich. The way he spoke of her carried a weight of respect and warmth, a kind of quiet reverence for someone who had filled his life with consistency and care. Miss Carter listened carefully, every word confirming what her heart already knew. As he spoke, he shared small details, how his grandmother sometimes told stories about his father, how she described him as determined and stubborn, always fighting for something better. The stories painted a picture that grew clearer with every sentence. His father, Marcus, had never forgotten the struggles he faced in school, and though he didn't speak of them often, his mother had carried those memories forward. She made sure her grandson knew where they had come from, even if the full weight of those lessons had not yet settled into the boy's understanding. The conversation unfolded gently, like the slow peeling back of fabric to reveal something precious beneath. Miss Carter finally asked his father's name, though she already knew the answer before he spoke it. Marcus Taylor. The name hung in the air between them like a thread connecting two distant points in time. The boy did not notice the subtle shift in her expression, but inside, Miss Carter's heart swelled with a mixture of pride, sorrow, and wonder. The boy sitting before her was not only the child of a former student, he was a living continuation of a story she had been part of years ago. She shared with him then carefully that she had known his father. She told him about the years when Marcus was a student in her class, about how hard he worked despite the obstacles, about how he had carried himself with quiet strength. She spoke not as a teacher recounting records, but as someone who had seen the boy's father fight battles that others overlooked. The boy listened with wide eyes, his mind connecting pieces he hadn't known were missing. He had heard fragments from his grandmother, but never from someone who had stood beside his father during those formative years. The conversation opened a window into his own identity, revealing a deeper understanding of where he came from. Miss Carter told him about the notes she used to write for Marcus, slipping them into books and assignments, small messages meant to encourage him during days when his shoulders sagged with burdens no child should have to carry. She described how Marcus always read them with a shy smile, how he often tucked them away in his backpack as though collecting something valuable. The boy sat quietly, absorbing each word as if they were pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized was incomplete. When she mentioned the handwriting, the boy's face shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing with recognition. He spoke of the notes his grandmother placed in his lunch each day, how they felt special but also old, how the paper was often worn and the ink slightly faded. He never questioned where they had come from, assuming they were written for him in the present. But now, hearing his teacher's words, he realized that those notes were far older than he understood. They were not originally written for him, but for his father. And yet, through his grandmother's care, they had been passed down to him as a kind of inheritance, carrying not only words of encouragement, but the weight of history. The full circle revealed itself in those quiet moments between teacher and student. The notes that once helped a struggling boy find the strength to persevere had now become a gift for his son, still offering guidance, still delivering comfort decades later. It was not just a story about survival or success, but about the unseen threads that bind people across time, threads woven from kindness, resilience, and love. Miss Carter felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she looked at the boy. She saw not just his father's reflection in him, but the continuation of a legacy built on small acts of care. The simple notes, written quickly between grading papers or preparing lessons all those years ago, had traveled through time in a way she never imagined. They had endured moves, hardships, and the ordinary erosion of years, and yet here they were, still doing their quiet work in the life of this boy who now sat before her. The weight of it was almost too much to speak, and so, for a moment, They sat together in silence, allowing the enormity of what they had uncovered to settle gently between them. It was not a silence of awkwardness, but of deep understanding, the kind of quiet shared by people who have stumbled upon something far larger than themselves. In that moment, Miss Carter was reminded of why she had chosen to teach, why she had stayed through years of challenges and heartbreaks. This was the reason, the hope that small gestures, even unseen, could ripple forward into lives she might never fully witness. The bell eventually rang, signaling the end of study hall and the return to the day's routine. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The boy gathered his things and stood to leave, but not before offering Miss Carter a small smile, one filled with new meaning. She returned the gesture, knowing they had crossed a bridge that few teachers and students ever get to cross. A hidden story had revealed itself, and with it came a new layer of connection that neither time nor distance could erase. As he walked back into the hallway, blending once again into the stream of students flowing to their next classes, Miss Carter watched him with a heart both heavy and light. She thought of Marcus and the long road he had traveled, of the grandmother who had preserved those notes with such quiet devotion, and of the boy now carrying that legacy forward. And in that reflection, she understood that while the world often forgets the small things, kindness endures, finding its way back when least expected, breathing life into new generations. The days following their conversation unfolded like the soft turn of pages in a storybook, finally reaching its long-lost chapter. Miss Carter and the boy moved through their daily routines as always, but an unspoken thread now connected them, one that neither needed to voice aloud. The air between them carried a quiet understanding, a shared reverence for the story they had uncovered together. What had begun as a forgotten note hidden in a sandwich had now revealed itself as a living narrative that neither of them had anticipated. But while the weight of the discovery lingered warmly in both of their hearts, neither fully realized how far its echoes would soon travel beyond the quiet corner of their lives. The boy continued to sit in his usual seat at the far end of the lunchroom, unpacking his lunch with the same deliberate care as before. Yet now, even the act of unwrapping the sandwich felt different. His fingers paused slightly longer over the worn paper notes, his eyes lingering on the folds as though seeing them for the first time with fresh understanding. They were not simply daily gestures from his grandmother anymore. They were heirlooms, silent bridges from a past he now carried proudly in his present. The weight of those words, once intended for a young father struggling to endure, now carried the full richness of family legacy. As words slowly began to spread throughout the school, carried softly by the whispers of a few staff members who had learned of the connection, the atmosphere around the boy began to shift. Teachers who had once passed him with polite but distant smiles now regarded him with deeper acknowledgement. A few offered kind words in the hallways, subtle nods of recognition that hinted at the story they had only recently learned. His classmates, too, began to sense that something about him was different. Not because he had changed, but because his story had quietly elevated him to a place of respect. The quiet boy in the corner was no longer invisible. He was seen now, not for what he lacked, but for what he carried. Miss Carter found herself reflecting more deeply on the story she had lived alongside Marcus all those years ago. She remembered the late evenings spent drafting lesson plans while worrying about whether Marcus would make it through another semester. She remembered the conferences with his mother, where exhaustion and hope coexisted in her eyes. She remembered the simple but deliberate act of writing those notes, believing even then that words had the power to lift where systems so often failed. And now, standing in her present, she saw the evidence that those small acts had not only endured, but flourished. Eventually, the story reached the attention of the school principal, who requested a meeting with both Miss Carter and the boy's grandmother. The invitation carried no formal agenda, simply an expression of curiosity and admiration for the remarkable narrative that had emerged. The meeting was arranged for an afternoon following dismissal, held in the small conference room adjacent to the main office. The boy sat beside his grandmother at the long wooden table, his lunchbox resting quietly on his lap, while Miss Carter and the principal sat across from them. The room was filled with soft afternoon light filtering through half-closed blinds, casting stripes of gold across the polished surface of the table. The principal spoke first, expressing his admiration for the family's resilience and the unexpected beauty of their story. He thanked Mrs. Carter for her years of dedication and quietly acknowledged the often invisible impact teachers have on the lives of their students. Then, turning to the grandmother, he asked about the notes, curious how they had survived through so many years and found their way back into her grandson's lunchbox. The grandmother's voice was soft as she explained. She spoke of how Marcus, even as a young man, treasured the notes Miss Carter had written. He had kept them carefully stored in a small box throughout his adult life, often returning to read them during difficult moments. After his passing, the notes had been handed down to her. She had read through them many times, each word reminding her of the teacher who once gave her son the encouragement he so desperately needed. And when her grandson grew old enough to attend school, she began slipping one of the old notes into his lunch each day, believing that the same words that once lifted her son might now provide comfort to his child. The notes had become more than paper. They were threads of memory, carefully preserved to carry love and strength across generations. As she spoke, Miss Carter's chest swelled with emotion. She had written those notes so long ago, never imagining that they would find such a sacred place in this family's history. What began as an attempt to encourage a single student had evolved into something much larger, an unbroken chain of compassion that had stretched through time, connecting lives in ways she could never have predicted. The principal, moved by the depth of the story, suggested that it should be shared more widely. Not to elevate anyone's ego, but to remind the broader school community of the power of kindness, of the importance of small acts, and of the invisible threads teachers carry forward into the lives of their students. After some discussion, the family agreed, and plans were made to include the story in the upcoming school assembly. When the day of the assembly arrived, the gymnasium filled with students and faculty, all gathered for what they assumed would be another routine gathering of announcements and awards. But as the principal took the microphone and began to speak, the tone quickly shifted. He shared the story gently, respecting the privacy of the individuals involved, but illuminating the remarkable journey of the notes. He spoke of a teacher who wrote words of encouragement decades ago, of a student who carried those words through life's trials, and of a grandson who now read them daily, finding strength in the echoes of his father's past. As he spoke, Miss Carter stood quietly to the side, her hands clasped together, her eyes shining with tears that she made no effort to hide. The boy and his grandmother sat in the front row, their presence unassuming but powerful. The students, many of whom had never given much thought to the quiet boy in the corner, now saw him through new eyes. The gymnasium fell into a hush as the weight of the story settled over them all. When the principal finished, the room erupted into applause, not out of obligation, but from genuine respect. The story had touched something deep within them, a reminder that every person carries invisible battles and unseen stories, that kindness offered today might echo far beyond the moment it is given. After the assembly, many students approached the boy with kind words and newfound admiration. Some simply offered silent nods of respect, while others spoke softly of how moved they were by the story. The boy, never one for attention, accepted their kindness with quiet grace, his heart full but his humility intact. Miss Carter, standing nearby, watched it all unfold with a sense of profound fulfillment. The circle had been completed. The words she once wrote to lift a struggling boy had found their way back to her through the hands of his son. The story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to them all now, a shared testament to the enduring power of compassion. The boy continued to bring his lunchbox each day, still opening it with the same gentle care. The notes remained, each one a thread in the tapestry of his family's history. But now, as he sat at his familiar table, he no longer sat alone. Friends joined him, drawn not by pity but by genuine connection, their laughter filling the once quiet corner. The lunchroom remained noisy, but within its familiar chaos now existed a small sanctuary of friendship, built not from grand gestures but from simple, lasting kindness. The school returned to its ordinary rhythm in the days following the assembly, but something in the atmosphere had subtly changed. There were no banners or plaques commemorating what had happened. There were no headlines or television crews. The story that had quietly rippled through the building settled not in spectacle, but in the hearts of those who had heard it. And yet, for those who had truly listened, For the students who sat a little straighter now, for the teachers who glanced more thoughtfully at their quietest pupils, for the administrators who began to rethink what impact truly looked like, the change was lasting. It did not need to be loud to be real. The boy resumed his daily walk to school each morning with his lunchbox in hand and his head held a little higher. His steps had always been steady, but now they carried something extra, a certainty, a grounding. He was no longer just a face in the crowd or a quiet presence tucked away in the lunchroom's corner. He had not asked for recognition, but it had arrived, not because of anything flashy or loud, but because of who he was and the quiet strength he carried. And perhaps most importantly, because of the legacy he upheld without even knowing its full power. Each day during lunch, he still unpacked his meal with the same care. He sat at the same table, but it no longer stood in isolation. Other students had begun to gravitate toward him, some out of admiration, some out of curiosity, and others simply drawn by the calm confidence he exuded. Conversations bloomed around him, natural and unforced, often starting with something simple like what was in his lunch that day or whether his grandmother had left him a new note. And always, there was a note. Not everyone was an artifact from the past anymore. Some were written freshly by his grandmother each morning, continuing the tradition with new thoughts, new stories, new affirmations. But even the new notes were rooted in history, written with the same hand that had carefully preserved a teacher's words across decades. He kept them all. His collection grew steadily, a small pile that sat tucked inside a wooden box beneath his bed at home. It had once belonged to his father, a weathered container with soft hinges and an etched lid that had faded with time. Inside were the original notes, aged, delicate, marked with the familiar script of Miss Carter's younger self, and beside them, the newer ones, crisp and modern, but written in the same spirit. The box had become more than storage. It was memory, it was strength, and it was proof that even the smallest kindness could echo across generations. Miss Carter continued teaching as she always had, but with renewed purpose. She found herself paying closer attention to the students who rarely raised their hands, to the ones who kept their eyes down or turned in assignments without fanfare. She remembered now, with visceral clarity, how easily someone like Marcus could have been overlooked. She reminded herself daily that the students who said the least often carried the most, and she wrote more notes now, small ones, tucked into margins of papers or handed over discreetly. She didn't write them to replicate the past, but because she had seen with her own eyes that they could matter more than anyone realized. Word of the story eventually reached outside the walls of the school, carried through quiet networks of educators and community members who shared it not as gossip, but as inspiration. A local education blog featured it in an anonymous essay, protecting names but capturing the essence. It spoke of a teacher who had once lifted a student with words and of a boy who decades later still held them close. Comments flowed in, stories of other teachers and students, of letters kept, of quiet encouragement that had made all the difference. The story became not a singular event, but a mirror in which others saw their own experiences reflected. For the boy, life remained simple. He still helped his grandmother fold laundry on weekends. He still studied late into the night, often with a pen in hand and a note pinned to his desk as motivation. He had never dreamed that something so ordinary as his lunchbox could open a door to understanding, to legacy, to quiet recognition. But it had. And now that lunchbox carried more than food. It carried history. It carried the voice of a father who had once struggled and overcome, the hand of a grandmother who remembered everything, and the spirit of a teacher who had seen what others had missed. Other students began writing their own notes, in corners of notebooks, on napkins, in journals. Some wrote to themselves, reminders that they were capable. Others wrote for their friends. One teacher set up a wall in her classroom for words worth remembering, and slowly, students filled it with lines that helped them feel seen. It wasn't a revolution. It didn't change the world overnight, but it changed the hallways. It changed the way students looked at each other. It changed the way silence was interpreted. For the boy, the most important change was the simplest one. He no longer felt small, not because people looked at him differently, but because he had learned to see himself differently. He understood now that he was not just one boy at one table with one lunch. He was the keeper of a story that mattered, and he would carry that story forward, not with speeches or grand gestures, but with the same quiet dignity that had brought it to him in the first place. When he graduated, the lunchbox went with him. The notes, too. He packed them carefully, making sure the box was cushioned between his few belongings. He didn't know yet where life would lead him, but he knew what he carried. And as he stepped into the next chapter, the notes remained his foundation. A map written in ink and love, guiding him with messages meant for another but meant somehow for him all along. Years later, he would sit across from a young student of his own, watching as she unpacked her lunch in silence. He would recognize the posture, the solitude, the quiet search for comfort, and without saying a word, he would pass her a folded note, written by hand, just a few words of encouragement. He would smile as she opened it, knowing that this too would find its place in the chain of kindness. Because it had always been more than a lunch. It had been a beginning,